Hola amigos. We're going to talk about morphing verbs in this video. So this can get kind of complicated. Honestly, this isn't that challenging of a concept. It's just it takes a lot of memorization. So we have all different kinds of verbs. We've got stem changing verbs and spell changing verbs, and this is kind of a stem changing verb, but it doesn't follow the rules of our normal stem changing. Our stem changes typically only happen in certain forms, and then it's pretty consistent with a vowel to another vowel, or maybe two different vowels. But with the morpheme verb, there's a little more to that. It's the stem is going to change, and it's going to change pretty dramatically. For example, we can see right here, we're going to have the verb poner. We've got this infinitive, but the stem is actually going to become pus. P-U-S is our stem. And now that stem is the stem in every conjugation. Every form is going to start with that. Poder, right here, that stem is going to become P-U-D. That pud is going to be the stem for every conjugation. Saber, you can see the pattern here. We're going to have the S-U-P, sup, haber, u, caber, cup. So we have these stems are kind of weird, right? If you look at it, we got, poner, we got an N in the stem here in the normal stem, but in the actual morpheme verb and the preterite stem is going to have an S in there out of nowhere. Well, they're not too crazy. It's got an O, it becomes U. Saber, we got an S-A-B, and it turns into S-U-P, H-A-B to H-U-B, C-A-B to C-U-P. So the stems are pretty weird. But what makes it even more unique is that is the stem in every form, every conjugation. So let me direct your attention to over here in this bottom left part of the screen. Right here, what we see are the endings for morpheme verbs. And it's sort of a hybrid between what we've learned with AR verbs and ER verbs and IR verbs. We've got the ending is an E for the yo form, which is what we had with AR verbs, except we don't have an accent mark on these ones because we stressed the second to last syllable for these conjugations. So if I took like caber, for example, C-U-P, add the E right there, and I get coupe. Coupe is the conjugation of this verb, but it's going to have that C-U-P in every form. Coupiste, cupo. So we take that CUP and we add it to these endings. So let me go back through these endings again, though. So E, no accent mark here in the yo form, very similar to AR verbs, but no accent mark. Then we got the to form it's iste, which is also what we had with ER and IR verbs. So that's the same. And then O, similar to that yo form, in that it is just like an AR verb, but no accent mark. And the AR, ER, IR verb with morpheme verbs means nothing. We don't really pay attention to what it ends with this set of verbs. With these irregulars, they're just irregular. It doesn't matter that poner, actually all these verbs end in ER here for these ones, but we'll see we've got AR verbs in the mix. We've got IR verbs here. So it really has nothing to do with AR, ER, IR here. These are your endings for any of these verbs that you see here, and we'll go through more of them in a little bit. But any of these verbs right here, these are the endings we're going to use. Now let me continue on. We've got imos, istes, and yeron. Now those endings are the same ones we had for ER and IR verbs. They're one and the same. So even though we might have a couple AR verbs in here, we're still going to use these endings. It doesn't matter. Remember, AR, ER, IR doesn't mean anything with morpheme verbs. You just have to recognize that it's a morpheme verb. And if it's a morpheme verb, then we're going to use this chart right here. And you can ignore the AR, ER, IR charts that you've learned before. So I've gone through the verbs that have, poner, poder, saber, haber, and querer. I put them all together into one category because they all have, there is a U in the stem. And in fact, it's the middle letter of each of these stems. All five of these stems have 3 letters in them, and the U is the second letter in each one of them. So they have that in common. That might help you kind of remember which verbs are morpheme verbs, if you can kind of group them into these 4 different categories. So we've got the U stems. Now let's take a look at the UV stems. So tener, estar, andar, these are the 3 that have a UV in the stem. Now it's not as consistent. They're not all 3 letters long. You can see they're different length. But tener becomes TUV, and it's going to become TUV in every single conjugation. We take that TUV and we put it in front of the E here and the iste and the O, and we get tuve, tuviste, tuvo, tuvimos, tuvistes, tuvieron. Again, it doesn't matter if that's an ER verb. This is the ending that we use for it. Estar, the stem becomes ESTUV, and it's going to be that in every form. Estuve, estuviste, estuvo, estuvimos, estuvistes, estuvieron. Andar, we got ANDUV is the stem for every form. Anduve, anduviste, anduvo, anduvimos, anduvistes, anduvieron. So it is a little bit weird, a little more unconventional than what we've learned before, but you've got to know which verbs do this and then what the stem becomes, and then make sure you know what endings to use. Let me go over to the I stems. Now these all have I's in the stems. We get, querer becomes quis, Q-U-I-S. Is what they have in common is that I. Venir becomes vin, V-I-N. Hacer becomes is, H-I-C. And actually have hacer conjugated out for us because it is a little bit irregular, and that we've got hacer becomes ise. So you can see we've started off with H-I-C as the stem, H-I-C right there. We've got that right here. There's our stem. We add the right there, that E with the stem. We've got H-I-C, and then we add that E. Now go to the to form. We also have H-I-C as our stem. And then we added iste, which is what our to form ending is for morphing verbs. Let me skip over here for a minute. You can see that we got something highlighted. We'll go over in a second. Hicimos, H-I-C is the stem. Imos is the ending. That's what we use for morphing verbs. It is an ER verb, but it doesn't matter. AR, ER, IR, we're still going to use these same endings just because it's a morphing verb. HIC plus the istes ending, hiciste, and hicieron. Good. Now I go over here. This actually has a spell change on top of this change. If I spelled this H-I-C-O, C-O is pronounced co. So this would be equal if we kept that same spelling. Remember, we want to be consistent in Spanish. So we actually changed the spelling in the third person of this hacer to a Z instead of a C, just to keep that same sound. So hizo, hice, hiciste, hizo. So it's pronounced the way you would think it would be pronounced, but we got to make sure the spelling is consistent with the way we pronounce it. So there's our first exception. Everything else would work out perfectly. You take your stem, you add your endings, and you'll see that it gets conjugated very well. And in fact, let me show you a little peek of some of these verbs we've already talked about. Here are the UV ones. You can see them all conjugated out. Everyone, andar becomes ANDUV. That's the stem in every form. So if you look beyond this yo form here, they all have ANDUV in it. And then we have got the endings are consistent. E, iste, o, imos, istes, nieron. You'll notice there are 0 accent marks in any of these conjugations. Tener, TUV is the stem. We add those same endings. Estar, ESTUV is the stem. We add those same exact endings. Poder, poner, saber, haber, caber. There's those U stems. And then we had hacer we just talked about. Remember, we see that, I don't know where this came from. But I'll go back to hacer. We've got even that spell changes in there. But everything else works out great. Go below it. We got our other 2 stems that have the I in it with querer and venir. We got those 2. They all have I's in it, Q-U-I-S-V-I-N. And then those are the stems throughout, no exceptions. That works out very well. All right, let me go back to the final stems. These are ones that end in J, and these are going to be treated just a little bit differently. We've got decir, traer, and these verbs have J at the end of the stem. D-I-J, T-R-A-J, but you still take that and then you add those endings to it with one little change. Let me go ahead and show that to you. Okay, right here. You can see this is the endings we're actually going to use for the J stems. E, iste, o, imos, istes, and eron. Notice here, the E-R-O-N is the ending we use for the J stems, not I-E-R-O-N. We're not using this one right here. We're not using, sorry. we're not using that ending. That's what we use for every other one, but the ones with the J, we don't have the I of that ending. We just use right here where it's highlighted that E-R-O-N. E-R-O-N. So I skipped conducir when we were going through this for a reason, because I want to highlight that every verb that ends in these 5 letters, ducir, is going to have the same change. So if you notice that a verb ends in D-U-C-I-R, the stem is going to be, is going to end in D-U-J. So conducir is got that D-U-C-I-R at the end, but it's got the C-O-N-D-U-C-I-R. That means our stem is going to become C-O-N-D-U-J. That D-U-J is replacing any D-U-C-I-R verb. So every D-U-C-I-R you see, we're going to turn into D-U-J. So here are some other examples. Producir. Producir becomes P-R-O-D-U-J. Traducir, T-R-A-D-U-J. Introducir, I-N-T-R-O-D-U-J. They're all going to follow that same pattern and have the same endings that go with it. Just like the other J verbs, right here, decir, traer, any ducir verb is going to have this exception in the endings, and it's going to be E-R-O-N at the end. So again, let me show you some examples of those conjugated out for you. We've got decir conjugated all the way out. Dije, again, we just took D-I-J and added the morphing ending. We got dijiste, we got D-I-J plus iste, we got dijo, D-I-J plus O, which is what we were supposed to have. D-I-J plus imos, which is what we're supposed to have. D-I-J plus istes, which is what we're supposed to have. D-I-J. And now we normally would have I-E-R-O-N, but with the ones that end with J are an exception, and it's going to just be E-R-O-N to finish off the conjugation, dijeron. And the same thing happens over here, trajeron. We've got T-R-A-J is the stem, and then we add E-R-O-N to finish it off. Now I got an example here with one of the ducir verbs. Traducir is the one I'm using here, but traducir, it ends in those 5 letters, D-U-C-I-R, ducir, and then we will, that means we replace that with D-U-J to make the stem. So we end up with T-R-A-D-U-J is the stem, and it's going to be that stem in every conjugation. And we add our normal morpheme endings, but remember that third person plural for any of the J stems. It's going to have our normal stem, but the ending is just E-R-O-N, not I-E-R-O-N. So I have this last one here. I've got ducir. Any verb that ends in those letters is going to have that ending. Just put whatever's in front of the ducir in front of what you see here, and you'll have it conjugated perfectly. So it's a pretty challenging one. It's going to take some effort to remember which verbs do this, what the stem becomes. So when you're conjugating in the preterite and you're using any of these 14 verbs, and then we can add on, there's another handful or so that end in D-U-C-I-R that would also get it added to the list, or anything that really has a prefix in front of it. So if we had de tener, for example, it's still going to keep that same that we got with tener, becomes T-U-V. De tener is going to become D-E-T-U-V. So I could, show you that real quick. De tener will become that in every form. It's also going to keep the same stem change that tener has. Oops. And let me just one more. So any verb that has a prefix in front of these will keep that same change. If we've got oponer, it's going to have the O in front of each conjugation, because there's the infinitive, put O in front of it. So morphing verbs, a lot to remember, a lot to keep straight, but you do need to do this. This is really important. These are really very frequently used verbs in the preterite. So whenever you want to say, I did something, hacer is the verb of choice, and we get to use it in the preterite most of the time. So if I did my homework, hice la tarea. If I came to the party, vine a la fiesta. If I said the answer, dije la respuesta. These are really frequent, so we've got to know them. So know which verbs do this. You just got to study which ones do it. I think it helps if you keep them in that chart of what kind of stem it has, you know, so kind of think these are the 5 that have the U in the stem. Remember which ones do that. And then what does the stem become? These are the 3 that have the UV in the stem. Know which verbs do this and what the stem becomes. These are the verbs that have the I in the stem. Know what the verbs are. Know what stem they become. And these are the ones with J's. Know what they are. Know what the stem becomes. And then, of course, additionally, you got to remember these are the endings we're going to use for it. We got to use these for all of them. We know there's a slight exception when we get to the verbs that have the J in it. We use the ERON instead of the IERON. And another exception is with hacer. We spell it with HIZO in the third person singular just to be consistent. All right. Gracias por ver el video. Hasta la próxima.